So when you're making that decision, think outside of just your own box, your own organization. Is there a wider impact to this behavior? Are there other individuals or other companies that have been impacted by this misconduct that maybe you need to allow them to have a say in the decision-making process? Maybe this behavior has crossed state lines or international boundaries through network intrusions or hacking. So in those cases, it may be in your best interest or the best interest of kind of society at large that you report them and that they are handled or investigated through law enforcement. Law enforcement also has information that you don't. So there may be patterns. So if you have someone who has hacked into your system and you think it's a one-time thing, so you lock it down, you figure out where the hole was and you patch it and you think you're good. Well, you don't know if several other companies in your industry or in your area have also gone through the same thing. So if law enforcement may have information, they may have open cases that are related to your case that you don't know about. And so by reporting it to them, you're giving them more information, you're giving them more evidence. You may have the key to the investigation that helps them solve or complete the case. And you don't know that up front. So take that into consideration when you are making that decision. When they are personal crimes, in other words, one employee against another. So say in the case of a sexual assault where one employee assaults another, it happened, in this example, it happened on company property. So you do have an interest in it, obviously. This is clearly an allegation of employee misconduct, but is it really your place to decide whether or not law enforcement should be involved? Look at your policy. How is it written there? Do you allow the impacted party, the complainant or victim in the case, to make that decision? Or are you going to force a report to law enforcement? I think the cases will, and through my experience, I've found that cases will be much more effective if the person impacted, the victim or the complainant, actually wants to make the report to law enforcement. They're much more likely to be engaged and involved in the process if they wanted that process in the first place. So there are a lot of states now in sexual assaults where a victim can go to the hospital, get checked out, have a sexual assault examination, forensic examination take place. Law enforcement is called to document it and seize that kit, the forensic examination kit, but then the victim still has the right to decide whether or not they want an investigation. So even when all of that stuff has happened and law enforcement knows about it, many states have gone to a model where they still allow the victim the right to decide whether or not they want to pursue the case. And the great thing about that model is that the state or law enforcement is able to collect evidence from that kit before it's lost, so in a timely manner. The victim gets medical attention without fear of being forced into a process they don't want, but then they still get to make that decision. So that model is being used even by law enforcement, and it should be a model that you also emulate, where you are giving them the choice. Provide information on what that means. Go out and talk to your local law enforcement and ask them for brochures or pamphlets or information so that you can share that with your impacted employee. You're not trying to influence them. You're not trying to influence their decision, but you are allowing them to make an informed decision because you have information that you are providing. And if you live in a state where they can talk to someone, say a victim advocate at the police department, they can talk to that person without having to pursue a case, know that inform them of that so that they know that they have that option. So I would highly recommend considering allowing, in personal crimes or misconduct, allowing the impacted party to make the decision. Include all of this in your policy. So if you are going to allow people to decide, then put that in your policy. Because you may be personally of the opinion that every case needs to be, that these cases are much more appropriately handled by law enforcement. They're criminal cases and crimes need to be reported. You may be very black and white about that. Or you may have a negative opinion regarding law enforcement. You can't allow that, your bias regarding law enforcement, to influence someone else's decision. If you put in your policy that you are going to allow them to decide, then you need to follow it. And you've heard that over previous lessons. A policy is ineffective. It doesn't do anything if you don't follow it. So make sure that when you write it in the policy that everyone understands that and follows it. It's okay to build in a safety exception or a risk exception. So a lot of states, in fact, most states, have mandatory arrest laws for domestic violence, because it is so difficult for a victim of domestic violence to press charges, because often that leads to further violence. But when you take that decision out of their hands and it's a mandatory thing, the hope is that will reduce the risk to them personally. Whether that's true or not depends on the case. But if you build in a safety exception where someone is saying, no, I really don't want to, but you see that there's truly a threat, a safety risk involved here that is beyond your capacity, you do not want to be the organization that didn't respond, that didn't take action when there was a risk, and then something even worse happens. So if you say it's a stalking case and you feel like the stalker is dangerous, there have been threats made, but your complainant is minimizing it, thinks that by reporting it, it'll get worse. And so you honor that and don't do anything, even though you truly feel that it is a safety issue. And then later that stalker comes in and engages in some sort of violence. That's not a position you want to be in personally or as an organization. So build in that safety risk exception and define what that means in your policy. You still have a responsibility to protect your employees and your business at large. So not just the one impacted employee, but your entire company and all of the employees. So if you believe there is a threat that is realistic, possible, probable, reasonable, it's okay to take action. But in the other cases, if you're going to allow the party to make the decision, follow through with that. If law enforcement doesn't know, you can't expect them to help you. You can't expect to have access to community resources. Communities have a lot of resources, from victim advocates to crisis centers to free crisis therapy to state victim compensation funds. But if there isn't a report to law enforcement, none of those resources will be available. A lot of police departments have victim advocates working in the police department, employed by the department. You can go to them first. So that's one of the discussion points you can have, or one of the things that you can think about is, if we need help from outside, if this is too much for us to handle or the individual to handle, we may have to go to law enforcement to turn on all of those resources. And then again, they have a knowledge of crimes and patterns in your community that you don't have. You don't know what they have. And so they are not going to be able to add your statistics to better enforce and prevent criminal behavior if you don't share it with them. So All of that being said about reporting to them, if there is a concurrent case, there's a criminal case and there's an administrative case. They're different. They both have different purposes. The law enforcement's case is regarding a crime. Their penalties are greater. They can put someone in jail. Their case can lead to legally taking away someone's freedom. That's why they have higher standards that they have to follow, rules of evidence that they have to follow, constitutional requirements, statutory requirements. They have a much higher standard that they have to follow in their investigations because the penalties are much higher. Whereas in your case, which is an administrative case, you are investigating, to simplify it, you're investigating whether or not they broke a rule. Your misconduct policy is a set of rules or expectations, and you are investigating whether that rule was broken and then deciding what to do about it. You have a right to do that. You have a right to conduct an administrative investigation when someone in your business breaks or violates your policy. So don't let anyone tell you you don't. What that looks like could depend on employment law in your state, bargaining agreements, contracts, unions, that sort of thing. But you have a right to respond to misconduct in your organization. You also have a much lower standard. There's a lower standard of evidence. Instead of beyond a reasonable doubt, generally in an administrative case, it's preponderance. So that's very different. The preponderance standard is the same standard used in civil courts. The way that you collect evidence is less stringent. The evidence that you're allowed to consider, hearsay, etc., much less stringent. So you have some ability and capacity to look at things and to consider and analyze facts or information that law enforcement or the prosecutor doesn't. So that is definitely a pro. You're not bound by all of these rules, even though you still want to do a thorough and complete job. You still want to do it right, but it's different.